There's a number of different places we could start this morning. I want to go to the Irish Times this morning. It's an article actually that you might see in The Guardian as well, and it's about Novak Djokovic, and the headline is immediately eye-catching. World number one Djokovic has become his sports Mayweather. So Brian Armin Graham has been reporting from New York over the past couple of days, and we all know what's happened with Novak Djokovic and his run-in with the linesperson on Sunday, hitting a ball into her neck. Through ruthless domination, Djokovic has become his sports Floyd Mayweather, sans the rap sheet, writes Brian Armin Graham. A champion leagues above his rivals, who rules with a technical brilliance that critics degrade as mechanical and boring. And like Mayweather, he's shown he's clearly willing to embrace the villain's role when it's thrust upon him, and has demonstrated time and again the ability to feed off negative energy. So I saw that this morning and I thought, Seán Hannon, the perfect man to give us a deep dive into villains. You're going to give us your top 3 sporting villains this morning, Shane.
This was a tough thing to narrow down, Owen, because when you follow different sports, you end up hating a lot of sports people. Sometimes the hatred is deep and you can't forgive, but other times you kind of like the person for that little bit of cheekiness, a little bit of maverickness that they possess. So the number 3 for me was someone that I've met a couple of times. I've interviewed him a couple of times, and he's a character, and we saw that quite recently at the World Snooker Championship. But it's Ronnie O'Sullivan. So Ronnie has had quite a storied snooker career, 6-time world champion now, of course, the most successful player in the history of the game, if you count ranking titles. He is just extraordinary, but he's had a number of moments over the years that you could probably say put him in the villains category. So famously, he walked out of a match against Stephen Henry, a UK championship. It was either a UK championship or a Masters. It was one of the Triple Crown events anyway, and the look of bewilderment on Henry's face is worth the YouTube search alone, because this just doesn't happen. He was obviously heavily fined. He went out on a bender that night. He writes in his book. But it was one of just a number of issues that Ronnie had. He was going through a tough time, but he had outbursts at referees. He was constantly giving out to referees and telling them they'd placed balls wrong and things to that effect. But the other one was 147s. So the maximum break, of course, the dream for any snooker player, except especially in somewhere like the Crucible in Sheffield, the cauldron of the sport. There were a couple of occasions where Ronnie refused the 147 in protest. So there was one occasion where he refused to pot the black at the very end. He hit a 140 break, and the referee Jan Verhaas had to say to him, "Look, Ronnie, do it for your fans." Ronnie got down and smashed the ball in to large acclaim. But he said a number of things. Peter Ebdon, a really slow player. Ronnie, of course, the Rocket, and one of the faster players on tour. Ronnie's had different moments where he's sitting smirking in the seat beside Peter Ebdon going, "Will you ever just hurry up?" James Cahill last year, he came in for the second session with his head shaved, a little bit like Britney Spears. And of course, at this year's World Championship, he referred to the younger players on the tour as numpties and players that he could possibly beat without an arm and a leg. So that's Ronnie O'Sullivan, number 3.
The difference here is that at Flushing Meadows, Novak Djokovic would get openly booed. At the Crucible, Ronnie O'Sullivan would get openly cheered by everybody, and the opponent of Ronnie O'Sullivan would be really up against it when it comes to the popularity of the crowd. Is that just snooker people? Is that perhaps an indication of the UK versus American sports fans, that there is a greater appreciation of the trash-talking Ronnie O'Sullivan than there is of, I guess, the moody, sullen figure of Novak Djokovic?
I think snooker is quite a polite sport. There's a lot of deference. There's a lot of, if you feather a ball or foul, you hold your hands up. But it's quite gentlemanly, a little bit like rugby maybe. But when you have characters like Alex Higgins, Jimmy White, Ronnie O'Sullivan, who come in and kind of liven it up a bit, they're a bit of a party animal off the bays. They make it a little bit more exciting, and they don't do things the way that they're expected to do. Ronnie just rails against authority. That's why he says the things he says in those interviews with the BBC, because he just likes to be a little bit cheeky and make things a little bit more interesting for himself. So yeah, it's probably an element of making the game a little bit more interesting, but Ronnie has done that for decades now, so he's still going strong, and long may he continue being a villain in snooker.
Yeah, it seems that there's going to be a thin line between a villain and an absolute hero to some people. It all depends on your own point of view on it. Who's in at number 2 for you?
Yeah, number 2, I wanted to pick someone from the world of Formula 1, because there are a lot of villains in Formula 1. You've had James Hunt, Niki Lauda, people who people love to hate, probably because of their success. And one that in recent years has really stood out for me is Sebastian Vettel. So Vettel, of course, driving for Ferrari at the moment, although that drive will be gone quite soon for him. He won 4 world titles on the bounce by the age of 26. An extraordinary driver for Red Bull. You can see the image of him in his Red Bull livery there on screen. But it got to the stage that he was so successful that everyone was like, okay, he's won 4 world titles on the bounce. He's going to clearly get to the Michael Schumacher target of 7. Now, he hasn't won one since those 4. Lewis Hamilton is the man on 6 and is probably on the way to 7. So he never really fulfilled that and didn't exactly exceed the expectations that everyone had for him at Ferrari. Ferrari haven't had a good time in Formula 1 in the last year or two, but it got to the stage where he was booed by fans during podium speeches. So he would win a race and immediately be booed. Extraordinarily successful driver, but there was an incident in the 2013 Malaysian Grand Prix. So Mark Webber, his Red Bull teammate at the time, it should be said, was trying to defend him and pushing Sebastian Vettel towards the pit wall. Vettel had the better speed, and over the radio, we mentioned yesterday, a lot of people in radio like to pat ourselves in the backs, but we had the IMRO Radio Awards shortlist announced, where basically everyone in the radio award gets an award. But the Formula One radio is extraordinary. And in 2013, at this Malaysian Grand Prix, it was no different. I mean, the Red Bull director, Christian Horner, the team, I'm going to win this race. He thought he had the speed, and in the end, Vettel won the race and literally did not care about his teammate Mark Webber. Something else happened in Mexico in 2016 during the final handful of laps. Vettel felt Max Verstappen was illegally blocking him and trying to back him into Daniel Ricciardo. Vettel yelled over the team radio, again, please give an award to Formula One's radio. It's extraordinary. Move, for F's sake. That's what he is. And Vettel said, I mean, am I the only one? Are you not seeing what I'm seeing? He is just backing me into Ricciardo for F's sake. And then the FIA race director, Charlie Whiting, came on and told him to relax. And Vettel hit back. Here's a message for Charlie. F off, honestly. That is the equivalent of shouting at your boss over the radio and telling him to F off, which we're not going to do this morning. But yeah, that's why Sebastian Vettel deserves to be number 2 for me.
Yeah, it's a good shout. There's a common thread that I'm noticing between number 3 and number 2, which I'll get to in a moment. I've got my criteria for what makes a perfect sports villain. I just want to hear who's your number 1 first.
Yeah, well, I said I kind of like, though, and I do like Ronnie O'Sullivan, and I do like Sebastian Vettel, so there's a little bit of that cheekiness that kind of rubs off me the right way. But number 1, I'm going to find it hard to say I like him, but it's unfair on the man, as far as he's a man. But August 3rd, 2013, Seán Cavanagh. I was standing on the hill, Eoin, on this day. It was wet, it was dreary. I was there with one of my best friends, and it was going to be a great day. We were thinking, okay, All-Ireland quarter-final. Monaghan could potentially make their first All-Ireland senior football semi-final in, I think it was since 1988. So the heyday of Nudie Hughes, Jerry McCarville, Bernie Murray, Ray McCarran. And I'm thinking this is going to be fantastic. We're a couple of points ahead, or a couple of points behind at this point, but Conor McManus gets the ball through on goal. And we all know what happened next. Seán Cavanagh pulls him down, yellow card. Of course, the rule changes came into the GAA after that, but it was one of those days that we had to stand there again for the second semi-final, which to my memory was a Dublin win over Cork, the second quarter-final, surrounded by Dublin fans who just slowly dripped into Hill 16. The rain came down. Monaghan had just lost to Tyrone, and I can't tell you what it's like for a Monaghan fan to lose to Tyrone. It's just like my granny's from Tyrone. I live only a number of minutes from the border with Tyrone here. It's very personal, and they're two counties who don't often get along. But that day, August 3rd, 2013, Conor McManus scored 6 points that day. Seán Cavanagh scored 5, so they played a serious role in the match. But it'll be forever remembered for that particular moment, and for that reason, and deservedly so. Seán Cavanagh is my number 1 villain. Kind
of rude of Joe Brolly to totally steal the limelight on that situation, and almost perfect for Seán Cavanagh. The perfect, I would have got away if it wasn't for you meddling kids. And I mean, there were no meddling kids because Joe Brolly was the person who came along and actually allowed Seán Cavanagh to get away with it, because the goalposts were shifted drastically in that whole discussion around him. It's interesting what we say about these 3 people. For me to be a really, really good villain, you need to not only win, you need to win very, very often. You need to show that the bad guy sometimes does come out on top and then do it repetitively, because that will twist the knife perfectly in the public watching at home. It can't just be... I don't think Patrick Reed is a perfect sports villain, for example, because he's only won his one major. He's only won the Masters on one occasion. Granted, it's harder to win in golf, but I just don't think that he gets into the God tier bracket when it comes to villainy. Of course, you know, there's been allegations of thievery and other things when it comes to his college career, and he does have some of the characteristics, but he just hasn't been as successful as Vettel, certainly not as successful as Ronnie O'Sullivan, and obviously doesn't have as many All-Ireland medals as Seán Cavanagh. See, that is the thing. When you are a Monaghan supporter seeing that Tyrone team beat you, if you are a Kerry supporter seeing that Tyrone team beat you repetitively in the 2000s, that is what creates the villain, and that's what takes them to the very top tier. I think another thing about them is you sort of need one big moment. You need, or maybe a multitude of big moments if possible, but usually these great villains have one big moment that you can point to and say, that is the defining moment of that villain's career. So Seán Cavanagh, perfect example there. Conor McManus. Now, in fairness, Patrick Reed probably does have his moment, and you mentioned a couple there when it comes to Vettel and it comes to Ronnie O'Sullivan. Other people you can put in there with their one big moment for me, Thierry Henry. Now, I don't think he is a villain in the global sense of it. He's certainly a villain in the Irish sense of it, and his one big moment is bigger than a career of villainy from Novak Djokovic, for example. What he did was far worse to the souls of Irish people than what Novak Djokovic did. I just don't think Henry probably has a long enough career to justify true villainy, but for that one moment, he was the biggest sports villain in our world. And also, I think one of the most essential features, and I think you've touched on this well here, is that you need a redeeming feature. You need something where, at the end of the day, you might root for that villain. Now, Ronnie O'Sullivan has tons of redeeming features. I think with Seán Cavanagh, that much was pretty much the same. And I actually find that the case to be with Novak Djokovic as well. The redeeming feature has been, maybe he doesn't have too many redeeming features this year, to be fair, but I think there was always the air of the villain around Novak Djokovic. He has got booed at Flushing Meadows before. I know there was no fans there over the course of the weekend, but he has been the villain of New York for quite some time and the tennis world as a whole. And the fact that he is the outsider, or had been the outsider, looking in on the Nadal and Federer duopoly for so long, that for me was a redeeming feature for so long. Like, you think about Jose Mourinho, for me, ticks all the boxes as a great villain, particularly up until he goes to Real Madrid. First stint at Chelsea, perfect villain is Jose Mourinho. His redeeming feature was Arsene Wenger or Alex Ferguson aren't winning the Premier League. Look at them getting frustrated by this Portuguese plucky upstart coming into the Premier League. That for me is what makes the perfect villain.
Yeah, like there's definitely an element of jealousy about the whole thing. Like, look, I'm not jealous of Novak Djokovic's anti-vax stance. I'm not jealous of the fact that he decided to host a tournament in the middle of a global pandemic. But some people could say they're jealous of his winning and his consistent winning, as you said. And Ronnie, Vettel, Cavanagh, Mourinho, these are all consistent winners. And there probably is an element of jealousy. I'll hold my hands up. I was certainly jealous of Seán Cavanagh throughout the noughties. I'm sure you were too. So
only a little bit.
It's an interesting one. It definitely adds to that villainy when someone is so successful.
Will O'Callaghan, good morning.
Morning, lads. You've left out the most important villain of all here.
Go for it.
Luis Suarez.
Oh,
he ticks every single box. He has that moment against Ghana, particularly, where he decides to obviously handball it to save a goal going in, which is going to be their magic story at that World Cup. And, you know, Uruguay go on to win in penalties, so he was justified in his villainy. He has beaten opponents on more than one occasion, and he is a serial winner. And I'd imagine that Luis Suarez would happily go to a child's birthday party and steal their presents. That is the level of villainy that you get consistently from Suarez. At the same time, he's going to leave Barcelona this summer as their third highest scorer of all time. He's won medals across his career wherever he's gone. And I would imagine ends justify the means. The other person that kind of jumped out to me, lads, when you were talking about it, was probably Mike Tyson, who you consider that he retained his popularity despite some of the crazy stuff he did over the years, including the biting of Evander Holyfield. I would imagine even though Mayweather kind of plays the comedy villain quite a bit to make sure the people buy his fights, I think Tyson was genuinely a bad man. And at the same time, he went out and knocked people out throughout his career and people loved him for it. So I think I'd put Suarez in there. And I think Tyson has to be up towards the top of the pyramid as well.